I'm Nathan Rutherford, and welcome to Myth Madness. Alright, this is the last episode in my current series on Hittite myths. In this episode, I want to discuss some things from Hittite and Hurrian stories that I've already talked about. If you haven't already listened to them, I'd recommend going back first. This one is intended as more of a wrap-up for the last 7 episodes. In episodes 23 through 26, I talked about the myths and religion of the ancient Hittites. In episodes 27 to 29, I retold stories from the Kumarbi Cycle, a collection of originally Hurrian myths that were also very important to the Hittites. To start off this episode, I want to first share another myth believed to be from the Kumarbi Cycle. This story differs a little bit from the others. It's not clear exactly how it fits into the rest of the Kumarbi myths. Unlike this one, the other stories all contain references to each other, although that may be because this story, once again, only comes to us today in the form of several broken fragments, and it's possible that the references to other tales are missing. The opening lines of this text, though, do survive. It begins by introducing us to the character who will be the focus of this story. The text tells us that unlike with Teshub, Shemish, the sun god of the sky, and Shashka, no one worships him. No one worships him even though his power is greater than their power, his word is greater than their word, his wisdom is greater than their wisdom, and his glory is greater than theirs too. And who is this great, powerful god that we're talking about? The author says, "It is Ashuni the Fine of whom I sing. Wise men told me of the fatherless boy." Ashuni means silver, and this myth is referred to as the Song of Silver. The name silver here is interesting. In the Hittite texts, the cuneiform symbols that stand for the physical silver metal are used for the name. In addition, in Hittite and Hurrian literature, a special symbol is always used to identify the names of gods like Teshub and others, but this symbol is missing with Ashuni. What does that mean? It means that the silver this myth is about is not a god. He is not divine or an immortal. As we will soon find out, he is only the son of a god, like a typical Greek hero. His mother was a mortal impregnated by one of the gods. This isn't a unique circumstance in Hittite mythology either. If you remember, back in one of the myths about the storm god Tarhun's fight with the serpent Illuyanka, the storm god had a son with a mortal woman too. Anyway, Silver's mother is pregnant. The text lists off the months, saying 9 months pass, and finally the 10th month arrives. The text describes how the newly born baby cried, and his tears flowed like streams. Fast forward, and there is a scene from Silver's childhood, and we can safely say Silver was a little terror. The scene starts with Silver striking an orphan boy with a stick. The orphan speaks back, saying, "Why are you hitting us? You are fatherless, just like us." So Silver's father is missing or absent. The myth hints that this may be shameful, as Silver is humiliated to be reminded of his fatherlessness in public. Silver began to weep, and weeping, he returned to his house and repeated the boy's words to his mother. It seems that Silver asked his mother about his father. She may have been evasive or tried to ignore Silver. He begins to hit his mother with the stick, and this is what follows. His mother took the stick away. She turned around and said, "Do not hit me. Do not strike me. Your father is Kumarbi. He resides in Urkesh and resolves all the disputes in that city. Your brother is Teshub. He is the king in heaven, and he is the king in the land. Your sister is Shashka, and she is the queen in Nineveh. You must not fear any other god, only one, your father. Kumarbi can stir up enemy lands and wild animals. He's dangerous." So now Silver knows who his father is, and that he is not just any old deadbeat dad. Silver's father is Kumarbi. Silver is the son of a god. Silver sets out for his father's home in Urkesh. He was no doubt trying to meet his father, but when he arrives, Silver finds that Kumarbi was not in his house. Instead, he had already left to go and roam the countryside. Unfortunately, there is not much of the rest of the story that survives. Silver proves to be quite powerful, and even more powerful than his father Kumarbi, who he may have defeated in some kind of fight. Silver likely defeats a series of gods in combat, and judging from his earlier love for smacking people with sticks, we can assume what weapon of choice he uses. One fragment says Silver seized power with his hands. Silver seized a spear, he dragged the sun and moon down from heaven, and the sun and moon gods feared Silver, likely because he had already proved unstoppable. So the sun and moon gods bowed to Silver and revered him. They begged for their lives. "O Silver, our lord, do not strike us. We are the luminaries of heaven and earth. We are the torches of the lands you govern. If you kill us, you will govern the dark lands personally." Silver took pity on them, and the sun and moon gods were allowed to remain in the sky. It is assumed that Silver became king of the gods. The storm god, Teshub, must fight against Silver, but is anxious. Teshub's brother Tashmishu taunts Teshub for his timidity and cowardice. Tashmishu spoke to Teshub. "Is it not possible for you to thunder? Silver has become king, and now he drives all the deities with a goad of pistachio wood." Teshub replies, "Come, let us go and eat. Our father Kumarbi did not defeat Silver. Will we now defeat Silver?" The two brothers held hands and together they set out. In one trip they made the journey to the city Silver was at. They found him sitting straight on his throne, and they feared him. We don't know the rest, but they must have defeated Silver somehow. How did they win? Trickery? Taking advantage of some kind of vulnerability? It's not clear, but based on the other Kumarbi myths, something like that was probably how it was done. Since there is not really much to this myth, I didn't include it in the Kumarbi myths earlier, but I wanted to share it in this episode because the first half or so of the Silver story might seem a little familiar. There is a god that gets a mortal woman pregnant before disappearing. She raises the child, who does not know his father, and the boy is made fun of by other children. He seeks to know who he is, and asks his mother about his father. She gives him the identity of his father, and he learns that he is the son of a god. The boy then goes to visit his father. Some people look at this myth and think, "Gee, that's weird. Where have I heard that before? Oh, I know. This sounds a lot like the Greek hero Phaeton, specifically the version recorded by the Roman poet Ovid." In Ovid's version, which I covered way back in episode 4 of the pod, Phaeton is the son of Clymene, who is actually an immortal. His father is initially absent, but Phaeton is told his father is the sun god Helios. His friends challenge his claim, upsetting the boy, and later his mother confirms the truth and Phaeton leaves, climbing up to visit Helios' house to be accepted by his father. The rest of the myth features Phaeton riding the sun god's chariot and almost burning up the world before being destroyed by Zeus. The beginnings of the myths are similar. The boys are raised by a single mother, and are confronted by other youth and said to be fatherless. The boys are told who their father really is, and the boys then leave to go find their fathers. These kinds of similarities between the myths of different cultures are very interesting, and sometimes we can interpret them as suggesting that the myth from the earlier culture was borrowed or inherited and modified by the later culture. So, do you think it's possible this description of the youth of Phaeton might have been inherited from the Hurrian story of Silver? To be honest, I have a hard time believing that. Not every similarity is evidence of a connection. Sometimes different groups of people can come up with the same basic idea. When looking at these myth parallels, it's important to ask, is it likely that multiple people came up with the same idea? Take, for example, sun gods. Almost every mythology, anywhere in the world, has a god or goddess that is responsible for the sun. Are all these sun gods descended from some super ancient sun god? No, certainly not. Everyone, anywhere in the world, can look up into the sky and see the sun. It's pretty easy to imagine different people looking into the sky and thinking, a god might have power over the sun in some way. Two mythologies having sun gods is not a unique enough thing to suggest a connection between the different cultures' myths. But what if the gods were more similar? Say, for example, two sun gods had the moon as a sister, that they both rode horse-drawn chariots across the sky, that their names had linguistic connections, and that they get up to the same sorts of things in their myths. Those similarities, especially when taken together, are more special. And there are some sun gods just like this, and scholars do agree that gods like this do have a common origin. But back to Silver and Phaeton. Two young boys are mocked about being fatherless. They find out the father is actually a god, and not a dead man or a usual deadbeat dad, and they go off to meet them. Are these similarities specific enough to suggest a connection between the two? To me, the parallel seems a little too vague. There are children today whose fathers are missing, and they wonder who their father is. And of course, in ancient times, periods with more wars, more famines, no antibiotics, and lower life expectancies, there were lots of children without fathers, and who wondered who their fathers were. There were lots of men who got women pregnant and then left, leaving them to raise their children alone. Seems like a lot of people in different cultures might have made a story about that, right? Sure enough, there is another example. In an Egyptian story called The Blinding of Truth by Falsehood, there is a boy who is mocked by another boy for not having a father. This story has no other similarities to the Phaeton myth from Greece or the Hurrian story of Silver. At the same time, think about it more generally. A child being raised by a human parent, while a god or goddess parent cannot stay around because they have god things to do, seems like a situation that would be encountered by any half-god or half-human child. So, there is not strong evidence of a connection between the two myths that hints at a common origin. It's too general a situation. What it does show, though, is that fatherless children are common enough in all three societies that people included it in their stories. But, are there other things in Hittite and Hurrian myths that are similar to other cultures' stories? Careful listeners might have caught a few of these similarities over the past episodes. They might have noticed some things that remind them of other things that I talked about in the previous Greek myth episodes. They might have noticed similarities like an interesting scene or two, or strange descriptions that are perhaps a bit too complicated or unique to just be dreamed up by two independent storytellers. I want to go back and talk about some of these today. First, let's talk about the oldest generations of Hittite and Hurrian gods. These are a strange group of older gods who live in the underworld. They are referred to in passing, or even listed by name on several Hittite tablets. They were considered powerful, and were also worshipped, but they are not included in the core group of gods believed to actually govern the universe. They represent an old order of gods, from a mythical time long, long ago. As a group, the Hittites referred to these old, discarded gods as Kerolesh Shayanesh, meaning former gods. This is the same language, former gods, that Hesiod uses in the Greek theogony to describe the Titans. So far, the Hittite former gods do sound superficially like that older generation of gods, the Titans, from Greek myth. They are both former generations of gods that now live in the underworld. But there is a bit more, too. The former gods were often depicted in Hittite art as 12 gods, all arranged standing in a row. In literature, lists of their names almost always count to 12, but there are some other lists that go up to 16, or even down to 7. The Greek Titans also numbered 12, although there were other Titans, other generations of Titans, that did fall outside this core group of 12. But what about the fates of these two groups of gods? They are both in the underworld, but how did they get there? In Greek myth, the Titans were defeated by Zeus and the other Olympians in a great war. One Hittite text does suggest that at least some of the Hittite former gods were defeated by the storm god Typhon and imprisoned in the underworld. But the Hittites' conception of these former gods was also influenced by the older religions of Mesopotamia. Some of these foreign gods' names pop up in lists of the former gods. What's more, several gods that are defeated by Teshub, like the stone man Ulukumi for example, are not in the lists, showing that the Hittites did not believe the former gods were only the defeated enemies of the storm god. The Greek Titans and their defeat do have Hittite parallels though, especially in the Hurrian Kumarbi Cycle. The first myth of the Kumarbi Cycle talks about various kings in heaven. First, we have the god Allelu, who is king for 9 years before being defeated by his underling, An. Then we have An, a sky god, who rules the heavens for 9 years. He is defeated by his underling, the god Kumarbi. But the way he is defeated is very peculiar. Kumarbi castrates An, removing his genitals and so also removing his power. That scene does sound a lot like another one from Greek mythology. In the Theogony, it is the sky god Uranos who is at first the king. He is defeated by the Titan Kronos, who also removes his genitals. It's certainly thought-provoking, but is it unique enough? Both stories feature children or underlings killing kings. But that's not that unique. History is full of the murder of kings and the forceful seizing of power. But what about the castration? That is another similarity. It's a gross detail. It's also one that might pop out to you as strange and unique. But maybe you might think, hey, in the symbolic dreamscape that all myths seem to take place in, maybe removing a man's penis and testicles might be an easy symbol for a storyteller to choose to show a man losing power. Well, the similarities between Kumarbi and Kronos continue. The Greek Kronos was threatened by his unborn children. So, after his wife Rhea gave birth to them, he ate them. But Rhea didn't want this to happen, so when it was time for Kronos to eat their son Zeus, the baby was replaced, and Kronos was given a rock to eat. Kumarbi had the same issue as Kronos. He was threatened by his children, especially the storm god Teshub. When Teshub was born, like Kronos, Kumarbi wanted to eat him, and again, like Kronos, he was tricked into eating a rock. Both Kronos and Kumarbi did not know that their child was really safe and sound, and hidden away. Kronos swallowed the rock and suspected nothing. Kumarbi actually broke his teeth on the rock, and then assumed his child had just been a rock the whole time. Kumarbi gives birth to the gods himself. Kronos' wife gives birth to the Olympians at first, but then Kronos vomits them up later. Even though it's in a different circumstance, Kumarbi gives birth to gods through his mouth too, but by spitting them out. There are other differences like this too. Zeus defeated his father Kronos, who defeated his own father Uranos. But in the Hurrian story, Teshub takes the throne from his father Kumarbi, but Kumarbi and An are not father and son. Instead of one bloodline, in the Greek myth, there are two bloodlines in the Hurrian tale. Although, this problem does go away when both An and Kumarbi become the fathers of Teshub. But another key difference is how Kronos and Kumarbi defeated the sky gods Uranos and An. Kronos used a sharp sickle to slice Uranos' genitals away. Kumarbi did not use a sickle. He used his own teeth to bite them off. So, if you assume that the Hurrian story influenced the later Greek one, where did the sickle come from? Did some Greek storytellers just add the sickle when they told their own versions? Or did they get that idea from somewhere else? It's possible the Greeks did, as there could be a parallel for Kronos' sickle somewhere else in the Kumarbi cycle. For that, we have to go to the last story in the Kumarbi cycle, the Song of Ullikummi. In that myth, Ullikummi is the latest rival Kumarbi raised to try and defeat the storm god Teshub. Ullikummi is very strong, and he gains his strength by being connected to another god who lives underground and holds the earth up. To defeat Ullikummi, the gods use a copper cutting tool, usually interpreted as either a saw or a sickle. They cut off Ullikummi's feet or legs, and he loses his power. But this Hurrian sickle is not only used to defeat Ullikummi. References in the text also say it was used previously, long, long ago, by that group of former gods to separate heaven from the earth. And in Greek myth, when Kronos, a titan, a former god, uses his sickle to castrate Uranos, he is doing the same thing, forever separating Uranos, the sky, from Gaia, the earth. Scholars look at these similarities and do suspect that the tradition of Greek titans was at least flavored by the Hittite and Hurrian myths. If this did happen, it would likely have occurred during the time of the Mycenaean Greeks, or even earlier. The Hittite Empire was long gone by the time of Hesiod. Such contacts between Mycenaeans and Hittites are actually confirmed by the archaeological finds of sunken shipwrecks, containing trade goods from both places. There is also documented evidence of migrants and refugees moving to the west. Mycenaean tablets talk about labor from Anatolia going to work in Mycenaean workshops and palaces. Migrating people included skilled artisans and laborers, but also their families, as well as healers, seers, singers, poets, and scribes. All of them, between periods of work, would have told stories to each other, and to any curious locals, too. Going beyond the stories of the Titans, were there other things in their myths the Hittites had in common with the Greeks? First off, there are the descriptions of how Kumarbi gave birth to the gods. I mentioned how he spits out one god, and how this could be similar to Kronos vomiting up his children. But the strongest images from Kumarbi's birth scene are the gods born by coming out of his penis, and the other god that comes out of his head. His body is even split open, his head by being smashed against a mountain. This is similar to some of the ways Zeus gives birth to his own children. In Greek myth, the god Dionysus is not born out of Zeus's penis, but is instead born out of his thigh, or in some versions, his testicles. And then there is the goddess Athena. She is born out of Zeus's forehead, after it is split open with an axe. Let's leave the Kumarbi cycle for a bit, though. As I mentioned in a previous episode, the Kumarbi cycle was originally Hurrian, and the Hittite version is considered an example of new Hittite literature. But what about the old Hittite stuff? As it happens, there are parallels here, too. Take Zeus and the Hittite god Tarhun. They're both kings of gods, and wield lightning. But they also have similar rivals. They both fight against serpents, or serpent-like monsters. Those serpentine enemies are Typhon for Zeus and Illuyanka for Tarhun. Illuyanka is literally a serpent. His name means serpent, and he appears in Hittite art with a twisting body of scaly coils. Typhon's description is a bit more interesting. He is not just a snake, but he is definitely serpent-like. I go into a lot more detail in the Typhon episode, episode 22, but in essence he is described as having snakes for legs, or having snake heads. Here's a quick reminder of the different Illuyanka myths. In one version, Illuyanka lives in a cave. The text says that there was a battle between Tarhun and Illuyanka, and the serpent won the first battle. Afterwards, the goddess Inara prepares a feast, invites Illuyanka to it, gets the serpent drunk, has a human helper tie him up, and then, while he is vulnerable, Tarhun returns and kills the serpent. In the second version, the battles between Tarhun and Illuyanka are in the sea. Once again, Tarhun loses the first battle. He is disfigured, and Illuyanka takes away his heart and his eyes, leaving him powerless. Tarhun has a mortal son, and this mortal son helps get Tarhun's heart and eyes back. With his power restored, Tarhun then defeats Illuyanka. There are a couple different versions of Zeus's battle with Typhon too. In some, Typhon is raised in a cave, like how Illuyanka lives in one. Typhon fights against Zeus and is victorious in his first battle with the king of the universe. In at least one version, the defeated Zeus loses his sinews, the muscles from his hands, and loses his power. It's not the same body parts as Tarhun, but the result is the same. Zeus's sinews are eventually stolen back from Typhon, either by the god Hermes in one version, or by a helpful human in another. Tarhun's son gets the heart and eyes back from Illuyanka after he marries the serpent's daughter. In the first Hittite version, Illuyanka is tricked into getting drunk by the goddess Inara. In one of the Greek stories, Typhon is tricked by some goddesses into eating the fruit of Dionysus, the god of wine. Typhon gets drunk and is weakened in his next fight with Zeus. In the second Hittite version, the battles between the storm god and serpent take place in the sea. In Greek myth, Typhon is chased through the sea by Zeus. What does all this mean? The point is this. The different recorded versions of Zeus's struggles against Typhon all seem to have some matching details in the earlier Hittite Illuyanka stories. What we could have here are the remnants of a big stew of mixing traditions, Hittite stories influencing Mycenaean and other early Greek ones. It could also be that the different cultures are picking up where an even earlier myth, by an even earlier people left off, and that Hittite and Greek people could be giving their own spin on a storm god versus serpent myth that had the same elements they both share. But let's be careful here. When comparing myths like this, it's very easy to fall into a trap. You might think that the parallels and similarities are hinting at an earlier story, a common story, that later people were only telling a corrupted and changed version of. And that is not what is going on. For example, the early Greeks did not just adopt Hittite gods and change up the names and the stories. The Hittites did not just take over Hurrian gods, or even take over Hattian gods because they had nothing else beforehand. What's happening here is more like recycling, and the stories were not damaged in this process. The different groups are recycling clusters of smaller mythical ideas. These clusters evolved as they were adapted by different people and added to their myths, or inherited, and then slowly lost or modified over time. I compare the process to genetics. Genes pass to the next generations, and bring with them traits like blonde hair, brown eyes, all sorts of things. Some of these genes are linked, and multiple genes together can result in more complicated traits. But the genes are also made up of smaller units, and these can undergo changes too. Sometimes those changes make something happen, and the whole gene and the trait itself will change. The various parts of the myths provided inspiration, were borrowed and reshaped by different storytellers all within their own oral traditions. Like with genetic traits, we often notice the bigger, stranger changes, but the changes at the lower level often more clearly show that something is inherited. Storytellers might take plot ideas from each other, but they often take specific language and descriptions too. For example, in Greek myth, the god Hermes serves as a messenger for Zeus. In Greek art, Hermes is usually pretty easy to spot. He wears a hat and also wears sandals that have little wings on the sides. He's also described as wearing them in several pieces of Greek literature. Hermes and his winged sandals. It's a very unique image, very typically Hermes. But it may not be originally Greek. In the Hittite myths, there are several examples of gods and goddesses departing quickly, and then going and delivering urgent messages to other divinities. And what are all these gods described as doing? They are all described as wearing the winged winds as shoes. These aren't details that affect the plot of myths, but they do show that some storytellers, somewhere, really liked that description and what it made them imagine, and because they liked it, they decided to take it for their own. And that's all for today. This wraps up the last 8 episodes on Hittite and Hurrian myths. I hope you enjoyed this introduction to the myths of an ancient and often not talked about enough civilization. If you're enjoying the pod, please leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. You can also send me a comment at www.mythmadness.com. Next time, I'll go back to Greek mythology to pick up where I left off at the end of episode 22. The next series of episodes will cover Greek heroes. As always, thank you for listening.